Thank you, Warren, for those very, very kind words, and it's good to be back and to share with you again today. Not often I get invited back to places, so it's terrific. Appreciate that. We're doing 2 weekends next week as well, and I'll explain a little about that in just a moment. Just by way of explanation, I suppose. I grew up in Geelong, born and bred there. My family were part of Churches of Christ. Actually, my mother was a Presbyterian and my dad was Church of Christ. But we really spent all of our lives in Churches of Christ. And then I went to work in a bank for 20 years and moved around the state. So the first 20 years of my life I spent in Churches of Christ. The next 20 years I spent in Baptist churches. And then I did the prodigal son thing and went into Church of Christ ministry, went back home. And my first church was in Queensland, in the Westmoreton circuit, and we could look out the kitchen window of the manse and see where E.C. Henriksen was born. For those of you who know anything of Churches of Christ history, he was a great Church of Christ evangelist. Rumour has it he died in about 1958. I can assure you he's still alive and well up there, though, because everything you did sort of was measured by what he did. Then we came back to Victoria, and I was the senior pastor of Bendigo Church of Christ for eight years, and then pastored Gisborne Church of Christ. So I know Ray, and from there I ended up pastoring the Corryong Baptist Church, and then the Tumut Baptist Church, and then we've come back to Albury to supposedly semi-retire. But I was looking at my diary the other day. I haven't got a spare Sunday between now and about the start of August. There's a real shortage of pastors in northeast Victoria. Susan, my wife, and myself, we did an interim ministry at Wangaratta Baptist. We went there for 3 months and stayed for 18. In the end, we thought we had to leave. If we don't leave, we'll be there forever, and we're not the people they need forever. And so after that, I did a little interim at Shepparton Church of Christ, and she went to be the interim pastor of Euroa Baptist Church, and has just completed that. She did 12 months there. And so every now and then we happen to be in church on the same Sunday, in the same church. And sometimes we even sit together, which is quite novel. But the last 4 years I've been the chaplain at Leicester and Son, and that's been a challenging role, and every challenge has its reward in that situation. And I've just brought some brochures are left on the table over the back there. If you want to have a look at those, you can. Feel free to take them. One about coping with trauma and loss. Another is about bereavement care and my role at Leicester's. And one's about understanding in your time of need and why funerals matter. And from there, probably leads me to next Sunday, that whilst today I'm going to be looking at how do we survive the grieving process. And I think last time I was with you, I was looking at bringing hope into grief and loss. And so I'm going to open the Word and sort of share about how we survive this grieving process. Next Sunday, Darren Eddy is going to be with us. And that's going to be a very practical time in sermon time. Service will be similar, but sermon time will be quite different. Darren's been a funeral director for over 30 years. He's been past president of the Australian Funeral Directors Association. I sense, to a large degree, Darren is the unofficial go-to man in Australia for funeral directors. Be nothing to get a phone call from a funeral director in Launceston or Armidale in northern New South Wales or somewhere in Western Australia or wherever. And they say, "Can I speak to Darren?" And you'd hear this conversation, what you need to do is this and this. A situation has arisen and they've rung Darren and say, "What do I do with this? This is something quite out of the ordinary." And so next week will be a little different in that Darren will speak for a few minutes and then he'll open the floor for questions. And so I'll dash around with a roving mic, and there are no questions that are dumb. I can assure you of that. The question that you think dumb is the question somebody else wants to ask. and they're looking for an answer. So don't be afraid to ask them next Sunday. And if you've got a friend in the community, a friend, a neighbour, an enemy, who you think would benefit from being in that situation, people want to ask those questions about funerals, about death and dying, but where do you go to do it? And people don't feel like fronting up to the funeral director to do that, but in an environment like this, people can have a freedom to ask those questions. We did a similar session in Albury a few weeks ago, and we took questions that went for just over an hour. And in the end, I had to sort of pull it up and said, well, look, some people have to go, but if you've got questions for Darren, he'll be here for a little while. Well, we spent another half an hour there. And so next Sunday, Darren will take some questions, and then we'll pull it up at a point in time, and then you can ask him questions over morning tea if you'd like to do that. But I can assure you the question that you want an answer for is the question somebody else wants an answer for as well. So don't be afraid to ask those. When I was with you 18 months ago, we looked at bringing hope into grief and loss. And I just want to recap on that a little, because we looked at what do we do when death comes. And, well, one of the big things we need a friend. We need someone who will be there. We'll need someone who will walk the path with us. But it's also true when death comes to somebody that we know, and we need to be the friend to that person. We need someone who can be there with us with the understanding that you can't solve the problem. You can't solve their problem. And we need to journey with people through pain and not try and take it away from them. And we need to allow them to express their feelings. And we looked at the 5 stages of grief, of denial, anger, bargaining, depression and acceptance. And then we saw that, okay, you need a friend, but how do you go through the process? How do you process grief? And grief can be expressed in a lot of different ways. Shock, disbelief, numbness, maybe an emotional release, and it's okay to cry. God knows the pain in our hearts, and he knows what it's like to lose a son. Sometimes it can come out in physical symptoms, headaches, body aches, and it is all right to go and have a chat to your GP. But then we saw also that, there we are, I've done well. That's the second point, processing of the grief. And the third thing we saw was that Jesus is the one who consoles and comforts. And in verse 25 of John 11, we see Jesus say, I am the resurrection and the life. And he comes to give them hope. So we looked at bringing hope into grief and loss. Well, today I want to look at how do we survive the grieving process. And in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14, Jesus himself says this in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are those who mourn. And whether he's talking in a grieving process or he's talking about a different situation, I think the principle is still the same, that there is a place to mourn. Some of you may know the names of Richard and Shirley Pearce. They were Church of Christ pastors in Queensland, and I met them when I was up there. But I went to an aged care conference in Melbourne last year, and they were running a workshop there, and they've set up what they now call, they're a bit like me in semi-retirement, I suppose, second half ministries, which is a ministry to people who are in the second half of life, which is a gracious way of putting it. And they ran this little session on flying solo. How do we minister to people who've been married for a long time, had a lifelong partner, 50 years, and then all of a sudden they've lost that person? How do we minister to them? And Flying Solo, a second half ministries, made this statement: the experience of grieving cannot be ordered or categorised, hurried or controlled, pushed aside or ignored indefinitely. It is inevitable as breathing, as change, as love. It may be postponed, but it will not be denied. And that's very true. We can put it aside for a while, we can try and hide from it, but it will not be denied. When we experience grief and loss, we experience it in a whole lot of different ways, in a whole lot of different life circumstances. For example, the classic example is death, the loss of a loved one, and we grieve the loss of that person, and that's very natural. Divorce is another one, another way. The loss of something that at some point in time was special. It may have gone sour, but there was something special there at some point in time. Job loss is another way in which we experience grief. You arrive at work on Monday morning, you've been with the organisation for 27 years, and you find out you've been retrenched. Or you arrive and you find your job has just disintegrated and vanished, and from there you find yourself in some other area of the organisation and you've got no idea how to do it. And there's grief there. There's also grief in moving in a job. As I said, I worked in a bank for 20 years. At one stage we'd had 4 moves in 8 years. And I think that the last time we moved, I think my wife cried all the way from there to the next place. We left friends behind. You lose them all the time. It's part of the dramas of being part of the travelling population, which both of us worked in banks. So for all of our working lives, we've really been losing our friends. And that's painful. It really is. We also grieve when children leave home. Sometimes we get pretty excited about that. But we also grieve some days, and they go off to work or they go off to university or wherever. And are they all right? What are they up to? Concerns, yeah. We experience grief when things like we might be involved in an accident and there might be the loss of a limb, an arm or a leg, and we can't do what we once did as well as we used to be able to do it. Or maybe people have been paraplegic and there's a loss there, and people grieve that there are things they can no longer do. Dementia today is another classic. The loss of the person you love, even though they're still there, and your heart it just pours out love to them, and they no longer recognise you, and they don't know who you are, and they don't respond to you in the way that they once did, and that causes pain. And there's also the loss of opportunities. The war was probably a classic example in that. People went off to war, came back, found things had changed. People below them in the pecking order had moved ahead of them, and they'd lost opportunities, and there was grief there. So we face the grieving process, and oddly enough, it can be a painful time, but it also can be a healthy part of the grieving process. And Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 13 says words to this effect: "We do not grieve as those who have no hope." We do not grieve as those who have no hope. One of the problems for Christians has been that some have felt, because God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble, then we don't have to, and we shouldn't, experience the pain of grief and loss. After all, if God is for us, then who can be against us? So therefore, toughen up. Get on with life. It was perhaps an era when people were raised. That was a common thing. I was 30 years ago, I think I said this last time, I was diagnosed with cancer 30 years ago. And my father's walking down the corridor of the Alfred Hospital with me, and he just said to me, "You got to get over this." Simple as that, you know. You got to get over it. All right. Yeah, easy for him to say. The problem surfaces in that situation, you know, where we say, you know, God is your refuge and strength, and that is true. But the problem surfaces when people, and often well-meaning people, take a few selected verses that suit their cause and place them in front of others in order to show them how this should work out in reality. But all that happens is that they promote guilt and insecurity. And sometimes I think what happens is they take the guilt off themselves and they put it onto somebody else. And then they feel a whole lot better. In John 11, Jesus stands by the grave of his friend and he weeps. In Acts chapter 7, we find Stephen, the first Christian martyr. And if you were to follow the passage to its final conclusion, you'd read this in Acts chapter 8 and verse 2. That, if I'd read it out of the NIV, it says, godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. If we read it out of the Old King James, it says this, and devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. And even if we read it out of a fairly modern paraphrase of Peterson's paraphrase known as The Message, he writes, good and brave men buried Stephen, giving him a solemn funeral, not many dry eyes that day. And you read that, all three versions say the same thing basically, that there was an outpouring of grief. People expressed their feelings. So do God's people grieve? Yes, we certainly do. And it's right and proper for us to do so. One thing we need to establish is that people grieve in different ways and on different timetables. I know of a lady who lost her husband after a 2-and-a-bit-year struggle with a terminal illness. When he passed away, her boss said to her, very kindly, he said, take the next couple of weeks off, do what you need to do. If you need more time, that'll be okay. Just let me know. She came back to work after about 4 days. And he said to her, what are you doing back here? And she said, oh, I need to come back to work for some sanity. And she went on to explain to him what was happening, that it was the only way she could escape the help of her neighbour. Because what would happen every morning at 10 a.m, her neighbour would knock on her front door in order to help her grieve. And she told her how she had to do it. She'd make me a cup of tea, sit down there with me and tell me how I had to grieve. And I was all right before she came, but she would reduce me to tears, load me up with guilt, and then she'd leave. And she went on to say to her boss, you know, over the past 2 years I've cried an ocean of tears, really have. So much of my grieving took place before he died. I'm okay, but I now need to move on with my life. That's not how the neighbour saw it. The neighbour had in her mind, this is how you grieve, but she's not doing that, so I'm going to have to help her with it. And she took the guilt off herself and put it onto the poor widow. And I sense sometimes we do that in order to make ourselves feel better. I heard about a man who was struggling with the suicidal death of his brother. And so he said to his brother's 12-year-old son, if you hadn't been such a brat of a kid, your father wouldn't have killed himself. How to win friends and influence people. He was struggling, so he put it all onto the kid. People grieve in different ways at different times. As I said last time I was with you, we sometimes talk about the 5 stages of grief. I don't take this as hard and fast and concrete, but it's definitely there. And the first stage is often denial, and we tend to deny the loss has taken place, and we might withdraw from our usual social contacts, and it may last for a short time, it may last longer. And then often we experience anger. The grieving person may be furious at the person who's inflicted the hurt, even if they're dead. Or they may be angry at the world for letting it happen. The individual may be angry with themselves. for letting the event take place. And we come to this point where we say, if only I had, if only I hadn't, if only they had, if only they hadn't. And then we find ourselves bargaining, and often we bargain with God. And we say to God, if you do this, I will do this if you take this away from me. The number of fellows in the war in the trenches who said to God, if you get me out of this, I'll become a priest. Well, God would have been inundated with them, I'm sure. But we bargain with God. And then sometimes we go through a depressing time where we feel a numbness, and the anger and the sadness may just remain there underneath. And then finally we might experience acceptance. And this is when the anger and the sadness in the morning have tapered off, and the person simply accepts the reality of the loss. Sometimes the grieving process is a bit like a circle, and it's sort of, there's a fixed point on the circle which triggers the grief, and we go round, and when we come back past, it triggers it off again. And then over time the circle gets greater, and so it takes longer for us to come back past the trigger point. Initially we might be going round like that, so every 5 minutes we recall the moment that sets us off. And as the circle gets bigger, it sometimes takes longer before we get to that trigger point. Sometimes we tend to think of the grieving process as a bit like the J curve, and we start. I'll use. Here we go. There we are. No, there's no plane. Does that work on there? It works on the wall. Isn't that magic? Isn't that incredible? Doesn't work. Don't know what we've done. Not to worry. What you've done there, Roscoe. But we find ourselves in a grief situation, and we sort of come down the slope a bit, and then finally we manage to work our way around the curve. And I'm inclined to think as we come down, we might go back and down, and we come around the corner and we go back and round and finally up a bit, and then back. It's a bit often a backwards and forwards. It's not just round and off we go, but we experience something, we come back, we go over it again, we get round the corner, we come back again, and we finally work our way out of where we are. And sometimes we refer to the grieving process a bit like the J curve, and we finally come out of the grieving process at the end. Some people see the grieving process a little like this, and I think this could be fairly accurate, more like that. That we get into there, and it is just a scramble, and we're all over the place, and finally we come out of the cloud, and life seems to work itself out. So how do we survive this grieving process? How do we come out of it at the other end as people who know they are of value? Because that's how God sees us. God sees us as people of value. And then how can we make a contribution in our world? Well, just a couple of things that might help. And I would have to admit that some of this is original. Some of it I've borrowed off other people, and some of it I've plagiarised, and some of it I've just plain stolen. And so some of it's mine and some of it's not. But I think the ideas have some merit. I think the first thing we need to do is you need to accept your feelings. You need to allow yourself to be sad some days. That's okay. It's all right to cry. It's all right to be sad. Find a safe space where you can shed tears. And, you need to have that space where you haven't got somebody saying, come on, buck up, you'll be all right. Or somebody who says to you, you've just got to get over this. You need that place where you can shed some tears and express your feelings. We need to dispense with the thinking that big boys don't cry, all right? They do, and they can, and it's all right to do so. I conducted a funeral just recently where a man in his 70s passed away quite unexpectedly, quite healthy, and his two sons just sobbed at the funeral because they didn't get a chance to say goodbye, and their dad meant so much to them, and they were grown men, and they just sobbed tears. So we need to dispense with the thinking that big boys don't cry. Ladies, don't apologise when tears come. The number of times I've been with females that say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm being silly." I said, "No, you're not. You're being normal. You know, it is all right to cry. If it's all right for Jesus to stand by the grave of his friend and weep, I can assure you that it's all right for us as well." So that's the first thing we need to do. Accept your feelings. Yeah, some days you're going to feel sad, and that's all right. You are allowed to. Secondly, look after yourself. That's very important. Perhaps at the end of the day, ask yourself questions like this. Have I eaten well today? You know, that's important. Good diet is in that situation. When my mother died, the rest of the family, we gave Dad 6 months. He lived another 11 years. Took us all by surprise. But our big fear was, and even though he could cook, our big fear was he will survive on raisin toast and poached eggs. Because he liked that, and that was easy, and that's what he'd do. You know, I think he'd have it 3 meals a day if he could. And his health was starting to decline, and I was living a couple of hours away, and it was a bit awkward. The big thing that really helped him was when he had a fall and broke his hip. He then ended up in hospital. They did all that. Then he ended up in rehab, and then he went into hostel accommodation on respite. I managed to talk him into that because he said they took him back to the house, and he said, "Oh, they took me back to the house." I said, "We've got to get rid of the back steps and put in a ramp, and we've got to have a handle here and a rail there." He said, "Won't be doing any of that. Never needed it before. Won't need it now." And from there, I said to him, "You know, the government will give you so many weeks of respite." And I said, "Dad, it's middle of winter." I said, "Why don't you take up a couple of weeks?" So I said, "Go somewhere that's got some flat ground so you can get used to walking on 2 sticks for a while until you can dispense with them." And he said, "Oh, well, I wouldn't need any more than a week." I said, "Whatever." So he went, we found a place, it was a nice place, went there for a week, and then he thought he might have a second week, and he never left. And from there, though, he got his meals regularly, good meals, 3 times a day, got his medication in the right order at the right time, and his health improved out of sight. One of the things that can happen when grief comes our way is that we can neglect ourselves. Don't neglect yourself. Make sure, have I eaten well today? Have I drunk enough water today? It's something my daughter constantly reminds me of. Have you drunk enough water today, Dad? Oh, probably not. Have I done any exercise today? Even if it's only getting outside of the 4 walls and collecting the mail from the letterbox. You know, some days we can become prisoners in our own environment, and we haven't experienced fresh air for over a week. That's possible. Make sure we get out, even if it's only to go and collect the mail. Don't stay a prisoner in your own home. Ask yourself, am I keeping good hours? Am I going to bed at a good time? Am I getting up at a good time? I'm not going to bed at 2 a.m. I'm getting up at midday or something. Make sure you try and keep good routines. All those things are important, and they will help with the healing process. Third thing I'd suggest is this: allow yourself to feel happy. And that can be a problem because sometimes people can sort of see us and say, well, they shouldn't be happy, they should be grieving. It's all right to enjoy life, and you don't have to feel guilty. I've stood at graves at the conclusion of a committal and waited for the family to say their last and do what they need to do. And there have been times they've stood there, everybody else is gone, it's just the immediate family, the children. They've stood there and done nothing, just stood there and stared at a hole. And they really needed permission to leave. So I've said to them something like this: if your father could say anything to you right now, what do you think he might say? Because I'm inclined to think he might say something like this: what are you doing standing here? You know, you've all got lives to live, go and get on with it. Enjoy life. And they've looked at each other and they've said, yeah, you're right, probably what he would say. And with that, they've left. Being at a grave and saying goodbye can be productive. Staying too long can be counterproductive. allow yourself to heed what your loved one would want, and that's probably to enjoy your life. When we find people at a grave and they stay too long, that's when you really need a friend, someone who can say, maybe time to go. Allow yourself to feel happy, allow yourself to enjoy life. So if you want to buy a cherry ripe or an iced coffee because you enjoy those things, go ahead and do it. That's all right, just so long as you don't have 4 of them in a day. All right? You are allowed to be happy. Fourth thing I'd suggest is this: be yourself. Don't try and be what everybody else wants you to be. Be yourself. Sometimes being around people can be stressful and or awkward, so don't be afraid to spend some time by yourself. So you need to spend some time by yourself, but you need to spend some time with friends as well. When you spend time by yourself, go for a walk. Go to the pictures. You know, it's a good time to spend time by yourself. Plan for the times that might be difficult. Things like birthdays, Christmas, anniversaries, etc. Perhaps that might be the time to handpick a few trusted friends to help you across those times. Don't be afraid to remember and stay connected to your loved ones. You don't have to come home from a funeral and take down all the photos. Some people do. That was part of my life. It's now no longer part of my life, so we'll get rid of it. It's just a knee-jerk reaction. You don't have to take down all the photos, but choose how you want to remember them. That's important. I knew of a husband and wife who had a long and happy marriage, and she used to collect thimbles, you know, not bomb those ones, sewing thimbles, little ones you put on your thumb. Remember those? I presume some people still have them. Well, she had this whole collection of them. Some were metal, some were plastic, some were ceramic, some were decorated, all sorts. And she had this quite vast collection of them. And what she used to do was she'd sit them on the windowsills around the house. Her husband couldn't stand it. So what he'd do when she went out, he'd go and get all the thimbles and put them back in the drawer. She'd come home, open the drawer, get them all out, put them back on the windowsills again. It was a game. It went on for years. They loved each other. He couldn't stand them, she loved them. From there, she wasn't well, went to see the doctor, was admitted to hospital, and within a week she died. Very suddenly, quite sadly. When she went into hospital, well, he thought, here's his big chance, and he opened the drawer, put all the thimbles in the drawer. Came home from the funeral, sat in the lounge room. What do you reckon the first thing he did was? Got all the thimbles out and put them all back on the windowsills. And that's how he remembered her. Don't be afraid to remember and stay connected the way you wish to. Saying goodbye is never easy. Maybe if there are a lot of people at the cemetery and you're feeling swamped, it can be therapeutic to go back to the cemetery in a few days later, either by yourself or with a trusted friend, and there you can say your farewell as you would like to. I've done that with some family members on occasions who've struggled at the time. They just felt, I just didn't get the chance to say what I wanted to because everybody else wanted to talk to me. Don't be afraid to do that. Sometimes families have a viewing and they write notes and letters and they put it in the coffin with people. That's fine. Good idea. Good to do. No problem. But if you feel swamped at the cemetery and you feel you didn't get a chance to say goodbye and you want to go back, a couple of days later can be therapeutic. May be good to take a trusted friend with you who will be there for you and not try and squeeze you into their mould. But if you want to write a note to your loved one, that's fine. Just write it. There will be a mound of earth that will still be fresh. And tuck it. Don't dig them up, but just tuck it in and cover it back over, and that will be fine. As God's people, we do not grieve as those who have no hope. Grief allows us to adjust our loss and find a new way forward in life. Jesus came to give us a hope for the future. And in 2 Corinthians 1, in the passage that we read this morning, we see very much that we need each other. And the comfort that we ourselves have received, we use to comfort others. We are created as relational beings. We see that Jesus lived out in John. We see that lived out in John 11 is where the disciples say to Jesus, "We'll go with you. We're not going to let you go alone in this. We will go with you." In Mark chapter 3, we see that Jesus called 12 that they might run around and do all sorts of things for him. No. He called 12 that they might be with him. Be with him. As relational beings, there's a level of relationship that is above and beyond understanding. When I was experiencing the delights of chemotherapy in the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne, I met a lot of people. I met a lot of couples who came and went across the time that I was receiving treatment. Met a husband and wife couple in my travels who had both experienced the delights of chemotherapy. When he was diagnosed first and came into hospital to have treatment, and she dropped him off and said, "You'll be right, off you go." And so she went off and played golf and then came back and picked him up. And that was fine. When she experienced the delight of the treatment, the same thing. He went off and played golf. The next time, she said, "I want you to stay. I really should have stayed. I didn't realise what it's like to be there and have nobody." And for me, it was just so reassuring that my wife was just out there in the waiting room. Or a friend who brought me was out there in the waiting room. We are relational people and we need each other. As followers of the Lord Jesus Christ, we do not grieve as those who have no hope. We grieve, certainly, but not like those who have no hope. For as followers of the Lord Jesus Christ, we have a hope, and it's an eternal one, and it exists now. In Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 19, we read this: "We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure." The hope we have is strong and it's safe. And in Romans 15, Paul says this: "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit." Let's just pray together. Father, today I just want to say thank you for all of my friends here. I say thank you for the love that they have for you. I just pray for those who might be struggling in particular today. I ask that you might come and surround them and comfort them, uphold them. May they feel the warmth of your arms around them. May they experience the depth of your love as you pour that into their lives. Father, today we say thank you in the name of Jesus for all that you've done and all that you're going to do. Thank you, Lord.